Hello and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Emily Harle.
And I'm Lucinda Rouse. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. Today we'll be finding out how one hospice charity has been diversifying its income and making improvements to its culture to better equip itself for the job at hand. I was trawling through Third Sector's recent hospice-related news in preparation for this episode, and it's a largely sorry story of cuts, redundancies, and a postcode lottery of a funding situation with big discrepancies in allocations depending on where in the country a hospice is based. But I also came across a couple of mergers, the sale of a building to save jobs, and one chief executive taking extreme measures to bolster his charity's income through a series of sponsored challenges that ranged from throwing himself out of a plane to getting a charity-themed tattoo. As far as I'm aware, our guest today has not followed quite the same fundraising approach, but he can correct me if I'm wrong. Stephen Roberts is the Chief Executive of North Devon Hospice, which was named Large Charity of the Year at last year's Third Sector Awards. Hello, Stephen.
Hello.
Now, please tell us, any North Devon Hospice Inc. for you?
Absolutely not, nor will there be. I think that's definitely going a bridge too far in the name of charity, but all credit to that Chief Executive. I know who you're talking about as well, so yeah, he's kept that quiet, actually. I need to see what happens at the next meeting. But yeah, no, I can confirm no ink in North Devon.
Well, I don't think we need to hide it. It's Martin Edwards from Julia's House Hospice. He actually wrote a column for us at Third Sector about this. So yeah, all credit to him, but entirely understandable that you're not planning to follow suit.
No, not this occasion.
You joined North Devon Hospice 15 years ago this month. So not long after the start of austerity.
Indeed.
And I wondered, considering the situation with hospices today, how do things compare from your perspective to back then?
It's a really good question. I think ultimately the first word that came into my mind when you asked that question was demand. If I look at our community nursing team, so these are people who go out into the community and actually look after and provide end-of-life care in people's own homes. When I first came, the average caseload they have in any given day, probably about 20 patients. Well, fast forward to today, that's literally double. The average caseload is more like 40. So I think as the population grows older and as we age with more complex conditions, you're seeing the need for end-of-life care, or what we call in the medical world palliative medicine, has definitely increased. So that's probably the big marked change I've seen in those 15 years. But directly linked to austerity, I do just see our cost base. And I know I could be standing here in any industry saying this, but I think it's acutely felt by the charity sector, who do operate typically on much smaller margins, and from food to fuel, energy costs to wages, that has just gone up just an incredible amount in those last 15 years, even more so in the last 5.
How is North Devon Hospice navigating those challenges?
I think first and foremost, it's about trying to give yourself a longer horizon as possible ahead of you to try and manage anything coming at you. And certainly one thing that we do here, which has stood us in fairly good stead to date, is we will build detailed budgets 5 years out. So I can tell you how much we're going to spend in stationery in 5 years' time. But in so doing, that gives me 5 years worth of runway, if you like, to see what we can afford, what we can't afford. If we need to add another nurse into our bedded unit, well, I know that's going to cost me potentially anything up to an extra £50,000 a year. So I've got either 5 years to find that 50,000, or know straight from the get-go that in 5 years, I just cannot afford it and it's not sustainable, and we have to say no. So I think it really is about trying to operate as heads up as possible. And I think the second thing is that we have tried really hard over the last 10 years to wean ourselves off reliance on gifts and wills and legacies. Obviously an absolutely crucial income stream for most charities, hospices in particular. But I do find that there is a huge vulnerability and exposure to that income stream. So we have tried every year to budget less for that income stream, because ultimately, if you run a business where maybe 25% of your income came from something which you have no control over, you don't know what the magnitude of that income stream would be, well, then you wouldn't include it in your budget, never mind the extent that charity sector does. So a combination of trying to operate 5 years out and wean ourselves off legacies has injected a little bit of financial resilience for us when we've hit some choppy waters, as we all find ourselves in.
That's really interesting, your approach to legacies, because I know that in general, legacy fundraising has been growing across the board. Does that mean then that when you get a big legacy, it's just considered a kind of nice bonus? And does it also mean that you're spending less time trying to generate legacy income?
Certainly not the latter. I do still recognise it is an incredibly important income stream, and we certainly are throwing our shoulder hard behind that to ensure that that revenue comes in. But it goes back to that reliance piece for me. And I feel that where we do get a good legacy year and the budget is breached, I can put that into my 5-year scenarios and it buys me more runway. It adds some more depth to that financial resilience. But I do see quite a few charities where it's literally crossing fingers that, well, it's okay because maybe a big legacy will come in. And you just can't operate like that. You can't in any way, shape or manner move forward with that kind of hanging over your head. So short answer to your question, yes, we use it as a bonus and to add into our reserves to manage deficit budgets, which we do face as a hospice charity.
And I'd like to move on shortly to talk about some of the new income generation activities that you've been pursuing. But before we do that, I wondered if you could very briefly paint a picture of how you've had to change things from an expenditure point of view as a result of the challenges of the past few years.
As a senior management team at this charity, we basically, going back to the 5 years scenarios, looked at those expenditure lines line by line and literally prioritised them 1 to 100 and what we could live with and live without. Most charities are already operating a pretty lean structure. So it's not as if nothing you expend doesn't have value to it. But ultimately, it is about trying to prioritise in brutal real time what is essential for you to continue providing your charitable mission, what isn't. And then with that priority order, we were quite thorough on what I call organic management of the bottom line, which sounds an incredibly corporate term, but essentially we've been very smart of where if someone has naturally left the organisation due to retirement or they've moved out of area or whatever, we really do put under a microscope whether that role can be replaced on a part-time basis, or whether the role can be done by a volunteer, or indeed whether we can actually do without the role. Now, you carry out that exercise year on year for 5 years, and it is amazing how much money you can then save off the bottom line without necessarily having to slow the ship down too much. But it also allows you to do it in a very controlled and managed way and not get to a cliff edge where you're sadly faced with having to carry out redundancies or cuts in services. I think that's probably how we've been managing our bottom line in these troubled times.
That's very interesting. You talk about putting roles of people who've already naturally left the organisation under that microscope. When you've done that, has there ever been any situation where you found actually this role is important, but it needs to be reimagined? And if so, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, I think a very simple example would be, obviously as a healthcare charity, if a nurse was to leave, it's normally a pretty quick decision that you would want to replace that nurse as is. That said, one of the challenges of operating in a rurally remote area, which North Devon is the size of the employment base. And to be able to not only recruit nurses in, but also to provide some sort of career path for new people within the organisation. So one of the things we have done recently is when a nurse did retire, rather than replacing them like for like, we created a nurse associate role. Now, for those of you not familiar with the healthcare sector terms, that's essentially where you've got a senior, highly qualified healthcare assistant who necessarily hasn't done their full nursing degree. So will then commence their nursing degree and qualification and would tend to a nurse associate. So that allows us to get nursing level input without paying a full-on nurse, the end of which, yes, we'll have to commit to giving them a role, but you've got that timeline of saving from a nurse associate to a nurse, as well as creating a wonderful career path for someone within your own organisation to move up the ladder. On the non-clinical side, though, we had a very long-established receptionist retire. and that went under the microscope, as I said. And in the end, we now have a wonderful team of volunteer receptionists called meet and greeters who've enabled us to engage with a high volume of the community that we serve in different ways. They're from different parts of North Devon as well, so it's great to have feelers out across different communities, and they've fulfilled that role highly effectively. And what is a very important role is often being the first face you see as you come into the hospice. So 2 examples there are quite different, but it is amazing what you can do if you actually just strip the sort of the institutionalization view of, well, we've always had that role, no, nothing can change, versus, well, actually, if you had to rethink it, is there another way of slicing and dicing it?
And have you so far been able to avoid service cuts and redundancy programs?
Yes. Here in North Devon, we have been successful so far in being able to do that. Unlike some of our colleague hospices elsewhere, we're very fortunate currently to be in that position. Although I would clearly state that as most hospices are operating in a deficit budget year on year, that is not something which we can clearly sustain for many, many years to come. And ultimately, if something isn't done, from a funding perspective, then we will no doubt have to cross that bridge at some point. But for now, we're operating okay.
And I wanted to move on to talking about your approach to innovation when it comes to income generation.
Yes.
So you've mentioned ways that you're reimagining roles, but how are you reimagining your funding revenues?
If you look at classical charity, yes, there's retail, yes, there's fundraising, yes, there's gifts and wills, and maybe some do some lotteries, and they're very established charitable income streams. But ultimately, they will have a ceiling. And the challenge for any charity, small, medium, large, is really to try and think innovatively and how can you create, and I think here's the magic word, a sustained new income stream. There's always a bright idea. By the time you've thrown time, resource and capacity at it, is it going to really be worth that return, that investment in 3, 5, 6 years time? And I think that's where a lot of organizations potentially come unstuck. So to really grasp the bull of the horns of innovation, I think that one of the most important things is to make it part of the day-to-day. Because often when you're living in an austere times and organizations, you're trying to make cuts, innovation is always the first victim. It's like, I've just got to concentrate on the day job and get through this. But actually, crisis is the birth of innovation. And I really do think that you've got to embed it in the organisation. How we do it here at North Devon Hospice is on every single staff member's quarterly objectives. There is a little section called innovation, where we challenge the staff to come up with an idea or to do something differently or something in an innovative way. And sometimes that can be really, really small, just a slight tweak on a process. But on other occasions, it can actually come up with something really, really big, which it did for us on income generation, because the idea to open a secure, paid-for dog walking field actually came from one of our nurses on our bedded unit, not from anyone in the income generation side. So I think step one, don't lose innovation, because you cannot thrive without it. And the current climate, I argue, you cannot survive without it.
So tell us about this secure dog walking field.
The first lesson I would say to the listeners is that for what we found in trying to come up with something that is sustainable for the charity from an income perspective is, first of all, look at your own assets rather than the funding streams, because it just may be that the return on the investment you require on a sustainable basis you've already got. And that could be a skill set you can sell. It could be certain space you can sell. It could be certain assets that you can get people to pay to use. In our case, it happened to be a series of fields that we have bordering the hospice to our flank. And we have literally thought of everything about how to appropriately monetize those fields. And I think it was Steve Jobs who said innovation comes from saying no 1,000 times. Well, we certainly did that. We dismissed selling Christmas trees to building eco lodges to arboretums to you name it. What actually stuck in the end was, in trying to find how we could use this asset to generate money, was to solve a problem locally. And I think that would be the next piece of advice I'd give to listeners, is what community problems are there which you may be able to have a solution for. Now, in North Devon, there is very, very heavy dog ownership. Obviously the United Kingdom loves their dogs, no more so in North Devon. But actually, even though we're in a very rural area, the number of places you can actually walk your dog other than a beach in a public space is actually quite limited, because most of it is private farmers' fields. So we did observe a lot of people travelling potentially 20-mile round trips to access a secure dog walking field. somewhere else in the north of the county. And we thought, well, hang on a minute. We're based in Barnstaple, the highest populous area of North Devon. We've got a field. Everyone loves dogs. They're having to do this massive round trip. Why don't we turn our field into a secure dog walking field? And the more we looked into it and did the research, the more it was starting to stack up. And then lo and behold, Waggy Tails Meadow was born.
What a wonderful name. And how is it performing?
Way better than expected. Admittedly, we did sort of be very tentative on our initial budget figures. We hoped that we would make net profit about 20,000 a year, 25,000 a year. And actually, this is looking like more like netting nearer 50. So just blown away by the response. But I do go back to that is because we saw a community need and it solved that problem. I think it all goes down to making sure you've got that robust data in the business case and getting the board on early doors to try and support you in your venture.
Amazing. And it is a brilliant idea, but it is an unusual one. So You mentioned board sign off there. How did you go about getting this idea past trustees?
I think for me, the simple answer to that question would be breadcrumbing. So I was a trustee of a large charity. And I think what sometimes senior management teams of charities forget is that a trustee is essentially a volunteer, and it's arguably part-time because you're not thinking about the charity and what it's doing every single day. So information you're presented at a March board meeting, understandably, as you go back to your day job and life, you're not necessarily going to remember absolutely everything at the next board meeting other than going through the minutes again. So we recognized that this was left field as an idea. We really had to make sure that we could make the decision for the board as easy as possible. So to do that, when we first came up with the idea and it initially seemed that it may have legs, excuse the pun, we said, look, we've got an idea how to use the field. It's a secure dog walking field. And then we just asked them a series of very simple questions. Number one, what are your concerns about this idea? Number two, what information would you need from us to make an informed decision? And actually, number three, what is the information you would need from us to make it a yes? And as we'd gather that information, maybe then 3 months later, we would represent the answers to those questions, ask them the same questions again, because obviously they move on in terms of what they need to know. And you do that again and again and again. And then by the time it got to the final board meeting, which was 8 months after the initial presentation of the idea, it was actually a rubber stamping exercise. The decision took about 5 minutes. And I think that's respectful of the trustees' time. I think it's respectful of making sure that they feel they're being done with, not done onto. Because I think if we gathered all the information we thought was needed, presented this incredibly polished business case to them, it would probably come across as a bit of a fait accompli. And then often you get trustee guilt where, well, I can't really say no. Look how much time and effort they put into it. And that's when charities can get in trouble because actually you lose that governance and you lose that critical friend and questioning.
It sounds fantastic. Although it does sound like a sort of 8-month process from originally floating the idea to your board to getting sign-off seems quite long. Did it feel like that, or was it always sort of part of the plan that it would take a long time to get this off the ground?
It didn't feel that long, to be honest, for us. I think we recognise that when you stray off the path in income generation, it can make a lot of trustees shift in their state of nervousness. So we really had to make sure that our business case was well thought out, the data was there, proof of concept, proof of need. And that does take time. And I think it's absolutely right to be patient because I think sometimes organisations, out of pure necessity, maybe don't do the full due diligence that they should do on an idea, and then something comes in left field and sinks the whole thing after you've already opened it and after you've already committed to it. So I think patience is very important in these things, and to really try and at every possible milestone in development of the business case, step back and see, okay, is this really going to work? Because as I said, I've seen other charities with a really great idea and everyone's really hyped for it, and that can often add a bit of decision-making blindness to what the reality is. So I think it didn't feel slow to us, and I think in so doing, we managed to make sure that when it launched all guns blazing and was hit the ground running.
And do you have any ground rules or like boxes that need to be ticked when it comes to floating a new idea for income generation?
Now, I appreciate this will differ according to your charity size, but for us, we felt that unless anything can create a net profit of £25,000 or more, it's probably not worth the effort. because often we know even as many charities putting on events, it's a lot of effort and takes up a lot of time, capacity and resource. And the net margins are often quite tight as they are anyway. So we found you can actually use up a lot of time and resource on generating 10,000 as you could on generating 25 upwards. So we draw the line at 25. That way we know is genuinely worth the effort. So that's the first thing, prove on your numbers that it can net 25,000. And then secondly, evidence-based. So we will proactively seek external evidence to show that this concept can and will work. If you can show in the early doors that you've got the evidence, it'll net 25,000, then yes, we can spend some more effort and potentially money and time on developing it further.
And were there any other income generation innovations that you floated to the board that didn't quite make the cut? And can you tell us a little bit more about them?
One of them more recently was actually to start running our own little mini fleet of ice cream vans. One of the biggest income generators for North Devon is tourism. I mean, in the month of August, the population swells by over 750,000. And we know that there's a number of sites across North Devon where ice cream sales are through the roof. And again, in terms of evidence I referred to, we were aware of one van with one pitch where the gentleman was retiring. So he was very open to how much he made per year. And we went, okay, well, that passes the 25,000 mark. So we built the business case. And actually, in the end, the board said no. And I actually sympathize with them because the one exposure on that was we were trying to staff that with volunteers to try and keep that net profit as high as possible. And even if you could get volunteers to be able to rely on them week in, week out to manage those times, the slots, etc., was probably a bridge too far. And secondly, the minute you added any permanent staff in there to cover illness, sickness, holidays, etc., it's starting to eat into the margins when it cleared 25,000 net by about 27, but it was starting to feel a bit uncomfortable. So we said no to that one. Another recent example was that we had been very fortunately left a property, a gift and will, and it was in a part of North Devon which is quite sought after to stay in as an Airbnb zone. And we were keen to maybe turn that into a holiday cottage, get income from that. The numbers stacked up, the revenue was strong, it would have been sustainable, but on two fronts it tripped up. Number one is we just didn't feel right because we'd probably have to spend nigh on 300,000 on the property to get it fit for purpose for the income. And something just didn't sit with us spending £300,000 worth of charitable income in one go on one thing. So that was and secondly, there was a good discussion at board level about reputational risk of running a holiday home or a second home. If your listeners are anyone from any areas of England or Scotland or Wales, Northern Ireland, holiday areas, knows that's a big contentious issue. So some board members felt, could it be viewed as a second home? Is that best use of charitable income? So we're back to the drawing board that one. But there's two examples where it was a no rather than a yes.
Both sound like great ideas before you start digging in, though. So
yeah.
And you have other income generation initiatives in the pipeline. I understand you've been considering franchises.
Again, this goes to solve the problem. So although maybe we're first world problem, but there's certain well-known as franchises across, the UK, which aren't present in the Barnstaple, North Devon area. I'll take one, for example, Nando's chicken. You have to travel a long way from Barnstaple, North Devon to get a Nando's. So is that something that we should be looking at from a franchise perspective? Obviously, the release of franchises by certain brands are quite onerous. You've got to pass through a lot of hoops. But ultimately, again, if there is a demand and if the income we can see is sustainable, then why wouldn't we look at a franchise in any shape, form or manner? I always go back to someone once told me when I joined the charity sector, at some point back in the day, someone said, I know, why don't we get people to empty their wardrobes with their old clothes and sell them? So that's how charity shops started, and it's a multi-million-pound business now. So I think it's important for us to not have any bias when we consider any form of income generation, and to go back to that adage of solve the problem of not having a Nando's.
And who doesn't love a cheeky Nando's, right?
Well, indeed, absolutely.
That line about trying not to have any bias when you're approaching ideas seems really central to the way that you're operating over at the hospice. And I think the culture is a really big part of that, right? Making sure that every idea is approached with respect and a willing and listening ear. I know that you've been doing a lot of work to strengthen the culture over at North Devon Hospice in general. So can you tell me a little bit more about how you're doing that and what you found when you started digging into that?
Sure. I think there's a little link to the culture piece from the income innovation bit. For someone to feel they can come up with an idea in the first place, I think you've got to try and make sure that they feel psychologically safe to do so. There's no fear of getting something wrong. And I think you've also got to make them feel empowered that no matter what your role is in the organization, we are actually all beautifully part of the single cause. Therefore, you not only do you have a chair at the table, you've also got a voice, and you're completely free to use that. Proof in the pudding that it was a nurse who came up with the dog field. So I think the first thing from an income generation perspective is absolutely to take away the fear of failure and the fear of, well, that was a stupid idea. And part of that is this concept, which is well spoken about and documented, with positive psychology. And I think that's something we've really focused hard in this organization. Yes, to create psychological safety for everyone, but also to recognize and to support our staff in emotional resilience. When you do work in a hospice and with end of life care, there is day in, day out truly humbling or wonderful moments. But it is an emotionally challenging field to work in. And I don't think there's a single member of our staff here who isn't touched by what we do in some way. And I also recognise in Laura's there's not a single staff or volunteer who doesn't give a little bit of themselves every time they see one of our patients or their family members that we support. So we've been working hard to try and sustain that positive psychology. And in so doing, what we notice when people get tired is that often that's when negativity slips in. And I think we could probably all think of group meetings where there's one individual who's maybe a bit more negative than the others, or can come across as the Eeyore of the room, and that sets the tone for the entire room. It can get very quickly, the energy levels drop in the entire room. So, but often it's done self-consciously. It's never done on purpose, but it has an unintended consequence. So one of the things we first had to do is identify that that was a recurrent theme about energy levels and negativity. And I would encourage any of your listeners, just out of interest, maybe at their next meeting, just to run a little quiet score on how many times someone comes out with a negative statement. Could be anything. Could be as soon as you walk in the room, oh, it's a nightmare to get here because of the traffic. Or I've had a nightmare morning, my laptop hasn't worked. Or well, I don't think that's going to work because all negative statements all take energy out of the room. Now, that doesn't mean to say that it's not okay to be okay, but in positive psychology terminology, you absolutely acknowledge there's a problem, an issue, and then you say something positive thereafter, and that just completely redresses it. So over a couple of meetings, I was tracking and I realized that our balance was wrong. A lot of people were making negative statements and letting it just float there, which did suck energy out of the room. So we identified this, we talked about it, and then collectively we said, okay, well, we'll start self-policing. If someone says something really negative, we'll go, yeah, and? And that's nearly become the annoying trigger word in the organization in meetings. Oh yeah, well, okay. And then we can do this to sort it or whatever. So that's helped, but that's maybe a little bit too simplistic, a bit gimmicky. So what we also do is at the start of every single meeting, whether it be a small team meeting or a broader departmental meeting, we will start every single meeting where we go around the table and people need to share what they're grateful for or something positive they'd like to share they've seen that week or that day. It sets the tone straight from the go that's on a positive footing, and it's amazing what lightness that brings immediately at the start of the meeting. And then in the quarterly updates or sit downs you have with your one-to-ones with your team members, again, we build in that they can self-score where they are with their self-esteem and their morale. And often that's a really useful way in a safe space, one-to-one, for them to share, I'm having a great time at the moment. That's why my self-esteem's low. Why is your self-esteem low? Well, because, and then we can address this both on a personal level as well as those sort of team perspectives. Through that consistency, that has enabled the organization to basically be a little bit more aware of how easy it is when emotional resilience is tested, which will always be, to not stay in the negative lane but transcend across to the positive lane with a little bit of effort.
And what kind of response did you get, or did line managers get, when it was pointed out that there was a certain element of negativity within teams?
I think that naturally the first one was, oh, is it not okay to have a bad day? And that initial thing of, oh, well, we've got to pretend everything's okay and we've got to be all happy all the time, you know. And again, that's not what positive psychology is about at all. So we did have to sort of reaffirm that it's absolutely okay to share that you've had a nightmare with your laptop that morning, on the proviso that the next thing out of your mouth is something positive. The analogy I use is, if you go, yeah, but, that normally ends up being a negative thing. So someone's got a good idea, go, you know, we should change the shift pattern on the chefs. Yeah, but if someone says, well, yeah, and we should also maybe consider this, completely different tone, completely different energy level. So we need a few pragmatic examples early doors to convince a few of the doubters. But I think it quickly became evident what a difference it made in the team meetings.
How have you seen that difference sort of manifest within the teams?
The main manifestation for me has been how self-policed it's been with the teams. So to the point where it's near a laughing point, where if someone comes in and has a bad day, they'll look at them and go, and what's the positive you can take from that? So probably I feel sorry for someone who's just joined us and haven't had the positive psychology training yet. They must think we're all a bit weird. It's amazing when you do point something out, which is a subconscious act, and you then frame it in a real-time example, and then you put that into the context of a team dynamics, how much they self-police negativity without constantly, you know, calling people out all the time for being negative. Again, life is tough. People have bad days. People go through some really, really hard stuff. And this is not about ignoring that. This is, if anything, it's not about resilience, it's about being tougher. It's about being supported. And I think that's an important aspect of positive psychology, rather than just coping no matter what.
Now, just as a final question for you, Stephen, I wondered if you could tell us very briefly about your alter ego and the occasions when your two different selves have converged. I'm speaking specifically about something that I saw on Instagram called House for Hospice.
I think you're probably referring to my pastime, which is I'm also a house music DJ.
Amazing.
I think my wife would say that's part of my midlife crisis, but I think as midlife crises go, it's probably a cheaper one. But yeah, I absolutely love house music, and I saw an opportunity to maybe put on a few nights to raise money for the hospice, which enables me to pretend I'm better than I am, and under the guise of charitable fundraising. So, but yeah, it's good fun. Nice to have something just to balance out the responsibilities and the privilege of running a charity.
Absolutely, 100% necessary to keep yourself going in the day job, I'm sure. Stephen, it's been such a pleasure to have you join us today on the podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Stephen, and that's it for this episode. From all of us at Third Sector, thank you so much for listening. And remember, you can always let us know what you'd like to hear more or less of on this podcast through our listener survey. If you're a regular listener, we'd be particularly keen to know what you most value between our relatively new monthly editorial episodes and our guest interviews. You can find the link to the survey in the show notes to this and every episode. Our producer is Nav Pal.